still an A and S, or sometimes we've had a student who called in to say, I can't vote. It's like, well, you're not registered for classes. You know? So it's not uncommon that Frank, as the administrator of that, will go back with any student who has a concern or says they can't vote and check the system to say, okay, are you in here, can you vote? In that case, once it became aware of the Kent School problem that was legitimate, he was concerned that if he stopped the election and tried to add them in, that it would throw it off, and so then all the students who had already voted would be kicked out and they would mess up the whole system. So that's when the decision was made, and Alex decided that he would send out that email to all students, not wanting to presume again that it was just because that was the one student who'd come forward was an undergrad, but then going back through and checking the program, and Frank has worked with IT and the registrar's office to check that, to see if that was actually the case. Yes, it was the case. Those undergraduate Kent School students weren't loaded in there.
And they're supposed to email us.
Well, I was going to say, technically there is a motion on the floor at the moment, so we've got to go ahead and consider that before we continue debating.
Yeah, I know. I was just trying to give information to your question.
That's fine. I just want to make sure that no one's name.
Paul is,
Yeah.
so everyone knows
Correct.
what's going on. Paul is typing in the motion on this document.
Okay, so the motion is to consider what is in bold right here, separate from the rest of the document.
So which part are we considering first?
And well, I'm just saying consider separately, then we have to move to consider it first. But I'm just saying consider that separately.
So the motion on the floor is to consider this as a separate vote, basically. And it has been seconded, and we've had a discussion. Is there any more discussion on that? Please.
Okay, so do we want to say we're gonna wait a month and do this like when?
Well, what I'm doing is I'm separating out the runoff part so that the three candidates will be in the runoff. That's going to be separate from waiting a month, so we can talk about them separately. Yes.
I think it's a good idea that we talk about these separately.
Russ.
And just to clarify, it doesn't mean that, all it means is that we can have the wider discussion without having to talk about this behemoth bill, and we can talk about all the infractions and then consider whether or not there's going to be a runoff with everybody in it by itself, so that we can talk about the court infractions involving the last item, and then the timetable separately, apart together from the runoff. Does that make sense for everybody?
Cory.
I think this part, the resolution whole, good. This part, I'm really still very, very concerned that by doing this, that our job as SGAs to give the opportunity to as many people as possible to be able to vote, to be able to be involved. I feel that by the apathy right now, I mean 20% for a regular vote, if it gets smaller and smaller, we're losing every time. Even if we only
It is about
it is about this. It is about this. Thank you. If we get the same amount, even if we had all 20%, then that's just going to make this harder. Even if you don't have all 20%, you're going to lose just as many people as we're going to gain by letting Kent. If only 20% of Kent vote, then we're only going to gain another 20 votes. So I feel like we're going to disenfranchise all the people that voted, and now we're going to come back to the second time by doing this. The bill I feel like is great, but I feel like it's good to go in the future and not necessarily right now. We should go for the future.
Okay. Paul, and then Aaron.
I was just going to say that I think that by considering these parts separately, everything will go a lot faster. We're not talking now about whether or not people should be included in the runoff or what voter turnout will look like if we postpone the elections. We're just talking about breaking this big thing down so we can do it more easily. And I'm going to move to the question.
Okay. Is there a second?
Second.
There's
Just
a
from a
second.
technical standpoint, I just want to be clear about this, because at some point in time, student affairs and the registrar's office are going to have to operationalize this to set up the election. So are you saying a runoff election would between all three? I just want to be clear so everybody knows this. Would the runoff election be between all three candidates, and you would only have a runoff? So then, if you still had a separation or nobody got 40%, so really you're saying have an election between two or three, and then still, if you don't get the 40%, you'd have a runoff still after that. I just want to be clear. So.
Well, yes, but there's a motion on the floor too. So we
I
can
just
talk
want to be
about
clear so everybody knows, because we're going to have to, because if you have the three vote, if you have an election with the three and you don't get, nobody gets the 40%, then I'm presuming you're still going to have a runoff.
Yes.
Okay.
But there's a non-debatable motion on the floor.
Yeah, the motion on the floor is whether or not we're going to separate these, and we're voting on if we're going to vote on that. So if you've got discussion, it's about whether or not you wanna move to vote on these things
It's
separately.
not.
No,
It's not.
discussion's over, it's been moved and seconded.
It's been moved and seconded.
So we need to like vote on.
So we're voting on moving to the question.
We're voting on whether or not we want to move to the question to consider these things separately, not whether we are considering them separately, whether or not we want to do that. Right.
So, all those in favor of moving to the question, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, please say nay.
Yay.
Are there any abstentions? In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. We are now voting on whether or not to keep these as we're voting on separating them, basically. Whew.
But there's no discussion of the voting.
We're voting, because we just voted to vote, so we're not talking about it. All those in favor of separating these two things, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, say nay.
Nay.
Are there any abstentions? In the opinion of the chair, I think the ayes have that. Someone wants to call division on me, that's fine. Alright,
Okay,
so we're
I'm
voting
going
on
to-
them separately.
Yes, I move to consider the bolded part separately from the rest of it.
Right, so which one's
We,
separate?
No,
which
they're
part?
separate, now we have to consider them. So I move to bring it onto the floor to consider the bold part.
Second.
Okay, we're discussing it, now we're discussing.
Okay, you can go
Okay.
Alright, so now we're
Withdraw the-
talking about the bolded part. It has
Withdraw.
been motioned and seconded, and now we're in discussion, Kyle.
Withdraw the motion.
Okay.
Withdraw the motion.
Megan's go.
Kyle, did I mess up, Jared?
No.
Okay, Kyle, go for it.
So there's a runoff today, so are you, I guess, proposing that, the votes that are casting today just be thrown out and kind of, like, a new runoff be started, like, tomorrow or after spring break or whenever?
Well,
I guess, is that what would happen?
well, part of the,
Since it says B runoff, I just wanted to know.
Gotcha,
since
yeah,
B
I can
runoff
kinda
is
split it up.
today and people have already voted.
so stepping back for just a moment to the one before we split it, I think the first, one of the things was that all items be halted. Was that in the previous one, so technically might be better to consider that one first, or.
We're
go-
considering this one.
Or go, they
We
go,
voted
if we're
on,
extracting.
that's one more.
Well, then I would, then maybe I would suggest amending.
I'll withdraw the motion, and someone else make the motion.
Just amend it in that one paragraph.
Did we not just pass that?
No, he withdrew the motion.
We're on.
It was an open
Passed to
motion.
separate them, he withdrew that, we were
Okay.
considering that one first.
So they're still separate. He withdrew that we're doing the bold one first. Is there a motion to do the other one first?
Yes, so moved.
Do I have a second? All those in favor of considering the unbolded portion of this document first, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, please say nay. Are there any abstentions?
Did we just?
Alright, we're considering the unbolded portion first. Is there any discussion on this part, I suppose? Amber, go ahead.
This is kind of to address a little bit of the senator from the speed schools concern.
It's in your,
Yeah. Is there a specific part you want?
You just want to be therefore resolved.
They have extra copies, somebody's copy.
I feel very
Amber,
lucky.
go ahead.
I feel very lucky here because I got to vote round one for SGA president, vice president, the top four, which is all I'm allowed to vote for as a graduate student. I also get to vote in the second round. I feel very lucky. I'm privileged to have had that opportunity. But there are 96 people who didn't have that opportunity. And if you really, really care about who does it, then you're gonna vote again. Or you really, really care, you're gonna vote again. You're gonna vote a third time. But a lot of these people really cared and wanted to cast a vote, and they never got to in the first place. So why do I get to vote twice, while they never even had a vote in the first place? I don't feel that it's fair, and I feel that it's just and right to give them the chance to have done that.
Okay. Sam, then Jared, then Corey, then Curtis, then Sana, and then Emily.
Yes.
Then you, buddy. We got.
My point is in the same spirit as Amber's, because I think this is not a question of practicality, this is a question of fairness and justice. If it is a question of fairness and justice, how many students will vote in the future, how many students will not vote, whether people will be more apathetic, is a separate question, a separate challenge we need to address as about student body. Maybe we need to aggressively promote that elections are important. So it's a separate question of practicality, the math, and justice.
Thank you. Jared, go ahead.
So there's also the issue of rules are important, and we are currently running under the guidance of the Supreme Court in this runoff election. The Senate is in charge of election rules, and this current election has no rules to it whatsoever. So if the Senate decides not to act today, if just to put rules for this runoff election, that's very important. And if this motion needs to be divided just to put rules down for the runoff election, that's extremely important, because as a university, it looks bad for us to elect our student body president under no rules. That's it.
Okay, Corey.
I don't think there's a single person here that wants to argue that this isn't fair, because I think everybody here agrees that this isn't fair. The whole point, though, is what's the best way to go about it, because right now it's confusing to even talk about the particulars or even the generalities about what happens to these votes. What happens with, is it only a vote with Kent School, is it only a vote with this? The problem is that I'm afraid that it's going to cause so much confusion now that there was a first vote, a second round of vote, and invalidating the second round of vote that's going on, and then having people confused enough to where they're not going to come around for a third time. I feel that we're going to lose that sensitivity of the true feeling of the university, and that's what I'm more afraid about. Obviously, the only way to make this fair is to go back in time and make this not happen, and that's obviously not going to happen. What we have to look at is what we can do to make it most fair for the most students possible, and so that we get the actual opinion of the university to act. If we lose half the students that we already had, the 2,000, and we lose half, and we only had 1,000, only 500 vote next time, it really isn't a representation of the university as such as it was before.
Yeah, I wanted to address your question, and she'll resume her question. I guess the question I really have to ask in return is, how many students does it take before we care? Does it have to be 100 students? Does it have to be 1,000 students? 10,000 students before we say, we messed up, we've got to do it again? Because ultimately what this is about is, in previous years, the runoff dates, everything was specifically denoted in that table. And so even after the preliminary results were announced on Friday, those of us who were trying to look through this kind of stuff, none of us knew when the dates were. We didn't know when voting started. Did it start on Monday? Did it start on Tuesday? And so hearing things early, that's the court's problem. And frankly, it's our fault too, because this rushed through, and frankly, it was snow, it was late. We made the mistake too. The Senate must also take ownership because it passed it. Okay, but it doesn't change the fact that the court messed up, in fact, in drafting it. We're both at fault. But in this particular case, one thing that will clarify, if your senators don't even know the dates, if I can't even look at the election rules and state, well, if there's a runoff, the runoff will be on these dates to my constituency, then it's a flawed process, and it's not adequate communication. So it's not a matter of, yeah, it is a matter of practicality, but frankly, that's one of the things we've been arguing about this whole thing together. It seems that from our perspective, it's always been more about an issue of practicality and efficiency than it is actual people's rights. And so, technically speaking, by the University Red Book, if even one student can't vote, then it's not a university-wide election. That's the Red Book. That's not our own stuff. So that's why we want to put this in here. And frankly, it's also why I want to state specifically when the dates are. There is precedent. We've done that in the past. I don't know why in the world they quit putting the dates for that, and I don't know why in the world it was bumped all up to be rushed right before spring break. Because in previous years, it was pretty much round one was right before spring break, round two started up afterward. And so essentially we're asking for something to be made so that the dates are specifically listed, so they can be posted online so people actually know. But frankly, the only way that anybody I think would have known about the runoff was either to assume get a broadcast email I didn't get, or look on Facebook if you look on Facebook. But not everybody looks on Facebook. Not everybody has the internet either. So but to simply state that, oh, there's a runoff, but not even have it formally published or approved upon by the Senate, that's a violation of the Constitution. And it's allowing the Supreme Court to cross over and violate its separation of powers by not only writing the rules, but interpreting it as well. Sorry, I didn't go.
Curtis.
Resume.
It's yours.
I have a few questions, and maybe Dean Mars can answer them. But this election cycle, there was an email sent out to everyone about the web balloting for Kent School, correct?
To all students. It
To
was
all
sent out through the
students.
all
so
student
anyone
emails.
who had a problem was able to use the alternative web ballot in order to vote, correct?
It was sent out to all students. Now,
I did
if
not
every-
receive the email.
Right, if every student opened it, if every student read it, if every student received it, I can't guarantee it, but it was sent out through the process at the university.